The Laundering, Volume 2, Case 04, The Captive Class. 2 seams filed in Revision 2. Open the case.
A state that imports people by the million binds their right to stay to an employer or a permit clock, then winds the population down by letting status lapse, and calls the whole apparatus humanitarian. 6 numbered sections in the spine, plus the 2 seams Revision 1 reserved. Revision 2 fills them. This is how coercion is laundered into administration.
Walk it. Start small. The Regina Cleaner.
A cleaning business in Regina receives a requirement to pay. The Canada Revenue Agency, acting on an estimate of what it believes is owed, reaches past the owner and instructs the bank directly. The account freezes. Cash flow stops the same afternoon. The debt has not been proven. The owner will contest it later, after the damage, from a position of weakness. The requirement to pay is not exotic. It is routine. That is the point. It shifts the entire burden of proof downward onto the smallest, least resourced actor in the transaction. The asymmetry is not a bug in the process. It is the process.
And the corporate equivalent.
A corporation with a tax department absorbs this. It has lawyers, accountants, a line of credit to ride out a frozen account. The Regina Cleaner has none of those. The same instrument that is a survivable nuisance to the large actor is a death sentence to the small one. The state hits where it meets the least resistance.
Widen the frame.
The single frozen account becomes a pattern. Enforcement capacity in a modern state is finite, so it flows toward the targets that are cheapest to hit, the exposed, the legible, the ones who cannot afford to make pursuit expensive. Small businesses lack the lawyers, the lobbyists, the political shields. Their cash flow can be destroyed faster than they can contest the claim. The large, protected entities move far larger sums through far more complex structures and attract far less visible aggression, not because they are cleaner, but because they are harder. Coercion travels along the path of least resistance and then dresses the result as neutral administration. That is the first law of the laundering.
Population scale. What are the numbers?
Over roughly 3 years, Canada brought in on the order of 3 million people through study permits, temporary foreign worker streams, and the rest of the temporary residence architecture. The temporary resident share of the population rose from about 3.3% in 2018 to 7.5% by 2024. A structural change in the composition of the country executed largely through administrative levers rather than open public debate.
And the conditionality.
The decisive feature is not the number, it is the conditionality. A large share of these arrivals holds status that is temporary by design and, in the worker streams, tied to a specific employer. When your legal right to remain in the country is bound to one job, the ordinary power imbalance of employment becomes something closer to captivity. The contract form launders it. What would be called coercion in any other setting is filed as employment. Precarity is the product. The permit is the leash, and the paperwork is the alibi.
Then the political weather changed.
Once the housing question and the services question reached the public mood, the same state that opened the taps announced it would close them. Notice the mechanism of the reversal. The government is not, in the main, mounting a visible mass removal operation. It is reducing the temporary population through departures, program limits, and expiry, letting permits lapse and counting on people to leave when their status runs out. Attrition by design is its own quiet form of coercion, and arguably a more effective one, because it never produces the image of force. No raid, no removal than, just a date on a document and a person who is suddenly out of status. The state manufactured the pool when it needed the labor and lets it drain when it does not. The people inside it absorbed the volatility on both ends. The architects bore none of it.
Where do they go next? Insert A, built.
Where Section 4's wind down empties out, Section 4.5 documents what catches them. The pool drains by date on a document, not by raid. But the absorbed population does not, in the main, return to source countries on the day the permit expires. Some leave. Some stay without status in the cash economy. A significant share accumulates in one specific sector, the private security industry. Scale it. The Canadian private security workforce is now substantially larger than the public police workforce. Statistics Canada's NAICS 5616 sector employs in the order of 140,000 licensed personnel. The sworn public police strength is in the order of 70,000. 2 to 1 or close to it, and the ratio has held or widened over 2 decades.
And the licensing floor.
In Ontario, the Private Security and Investigative Services Act of 2005 requires a licensed security guard to be lawfully entitled to work in Canada. Lawful entitlement is satisfied by a work permit. Canadian citizenship and permanent residence are not required. British Columbia, Quebec, and Alberta operate on broadly the same logic. The captive class is funneled into the friction-bearing tier of the same architecture that captured it. This is not an exit ramp from precarity. It is the channel by which precarity recruits precarity to police precarity. Accountability laundering. Layer 2. Made visible at population scale.
The 5 launderings. Why this belongs in the laundering, not in an immigration file.
Strip the scheme down, and it is not one laundering operation, but 5, stacked, each clean story covering for the next. 1. Reputation. The headline stays humanitarian and economic, while the delivered reality is a precarious, leverageable class. 2. Accountability. Route the friction-bearing contact through personnel who are themselves precarious and socially detached, and you put a buffer between ruling power and the public. 3. Demographic. Population engineering filed as levels plans, targets, sustainability. The technocratic language launders intent into procedure. 4. Moral. Precarity itself laundered as opportunity. We're giving them a chance. Covers we built a class that cannot say no. 5. Labor. Tied permits convert captivity into a job. The employment contract is the laundering instrument. It gives coercion a lawful name and a signature line.
5 clean stories.
Each one covering the seam where the next begins. Pull on any single thread, and the official account of that thread is reasonable. Only when you lay all 5 side by side does the shape of the thing appear.
Insert B was the higher order frame. Whose interest does the architecture serve?
The premise enters as the conclusion of the design process, not as an axiom imposed on it. The Labour Market Impact Assessment, issued by Employment and Social Development Canada, is the gatekeeping document for most temporary foreign worker permits. It is structured as an employer attestation. The employer asserts that no qualified Canadian or permanent resident is available. The federal department reviews. The worker, by program design, does not participate. The 2007 to 2014 expansion of the temporary foreign worker program followed sustained industry-side lobbying. Restaurants Canada, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture, and the Canadian Meat Council. Worker organizations focused principally on outcomes: employer abuse, workplace safety, precarious worker rights, not on the initial legislative design.
And the bilateral state-to-state level.
The Mexican and Caribbean Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program is governed under bilateral memoranda of understanding between Canada and the workers' countries of origin. Country of origin governments negotiate on the workers' behalf, principally on the basis of the foreign remittance flows the program generates. Workers' own organizations are not parties to the memoranda.
And the policy research infrastructure.
Capital-aligned, the C.D. Howe Institute, the Conference Board of Canada, the Fraser Institute, the Mowat Centre, the Institute for Research on Public Policy. The shared analytic frame is that controlled labour supply expansion is a tool of Canadian competitiveness. The corresponding research infrastructure from the worker side is smaller and has markedly less access to the federal department's design discussion. An architecture whose design inputs are dominated by employer-industry voice, with worker voice comparatively absent or downstream at every stage, produces an architecture structured for employer-industry need. This is not an assertion, it is the conclusion of the documented design process.
The method discipline. What does the case refuse to claim and why?
The strongest version of the argument above is built entirely from documented mechanism: the requirement to pay, the tied permit, the attrition wind-down, the levels plan figures, the provincial private security licensing floor, the labour market impact assessment design, the lobbying record of the 2007 to 2014 temporary foreign worker expansion. Every load-bearing claim is checkable, and the checkable ones hold.
And the two seams, revision 2, filled.
Section 4.5 reports the exit ramp finding. The strong service as exit claim is not carried. The Canada Revenue Agency and the Canadian Armed Forces screen harder, not softer, for status. But the friction line investigation produced a documented architecture that is arguably harder. The captive class is funneled by attrition into the private sector enforcement workforce. Section 5.5 derives the governing lens premise from the architecture's design inputs rather than asserting it as a frame.
The discipline.
The case still rests on the discipline that built the spine. The authority tier, tax enforcement, policing, the bench, is not staffed through the same precarity pipeline. Canada Revenue Agency hiring requires Canadian citizenship or permanent residence, plus security screening. Canadian Armed Forces enrolment requires existing permanent residence and 3 years presence. The expected signal of a lowered barrier enforcement funnel at the authority tier is absent, and its absence points away from that sub-thesis, not toward a cover-up. The friction line finding in 4.5 does not reverse this. It adjacent loads it. The wall at the top of the authority tier holds. The pipeline at the bottom branches sideways into the private sector enforcement workforce, where the wall is not there.
The case is stronger for what it refuses to claim.
The wall at the top is real. The branch at the bottom is real. The honest map shows both.